Now joining us today to discuss Kim Jong-un's trip to China is Dr. Kim Chang-su from the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. Dr. Kim, it's good to have you with us again today.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you.
So Kim Jong-un was once seen as a reclusive leader who looked like he would never travel outside of North Korea. But now in 3 months, he's visited China 3 times, he's gone to Singapore, and he's even come to South Korea via the border village of Panmunjom. Have we entered a new era of international travel for North Korean diplomacy? What does this mean?
I think North Korea has entered a new age of diplomacy because Mr. Kim has a tremendous confidence in his own management, his own government, while he is absent in Pyongyang. But also he has been treated very well from the world leaders, including Trump and Mr. Xi. I think North Korea has finally entered a new stage of diplomacy from the reclusive stage. But I think the most important thing is Mr. Kim this is a version of Mr. Kim's maximum pressure and engagement. As Dr. Chung Park of CSI has aptly pointed out, because we are talking about Mr. Trump's maximum pressure and engagement. But I think Mr. Kim has learned a lot from Trump's maximum pressure and engagement. So if you remember what he did last year, a lot of test firing of missiles, and over the last 5 years, as a matter of fact, he did almost 70 times of missile tests. And now he's all kinds of flurry of summit meetings with all these leaders in this part of the world. But she seems to be enjoying all this visit to the capital because he has been treating so well by the leaders. So this is Kim Jong-un's version of maximum pressure and engagement. I think the focus is moved to the second part, maximum engagement on his part, which has been pretty greeted pretty much warmly not just by China or United States, but mostly from South Korea. I don't agree with the idea, though, that Mr. Kim has become a global trotter. I don't think so. He has just traveled to very close cities like Pyongyang, the Tianjin, Beijing and Dalian. And Singapore, of course, but this is too short, relatively short. I'm sure he's going to ready to travel farther, including United States and Moscow someday. So he will become a global trotter someday, but not at this moment right now.
One of the interesting things, another part of the interesting things about his trip to China was Chinese state media announced Kim's arrival in Beijing before it happened, which is quite different from his previous 2 visits, where news of his visit to China was only reported after he'd gone back to Pyongyang. What do you think was the thinking behind announcing this like this from both China and North Korea's perspective?
I think both community countries have learned a lot from disclosing this kind of very important event from the world media, because they found they can take a lot of advantage by disclosing it already before it happened. I think because after all the world media knows where they are. All the flights are moving from, for example, like Pyongyang to Beijing, because we can get an on-time records of where they are heading for and where they're going to end. So there's no way denying all this kind of very important documentation, because technically it's available to us if you visit the internet, and you can have, as a matter of fact, have the exact location where they are right now, Mr. Kim's flight, for example. So technically speaking, it's much more easily available kind of information available to us right now. But also the two capitals have learned a lesson that by revealing far in advance, they can really kind of quiet all these unnecessary from their part, unnecessary miscalculation and all kind of bad misreading. So I think they have learned a lesson how they're going to improve and maximally PR, because after all, they're going to make a kind of visit to Beijing this time again. So this, instead of just delaying his report until his arrival in Beijing, so I think they made it already, same as he did in Pyongyang. But after all, when we had the meeting in Singapore, many speculations were Mr. Kim might drop on Beijing on his way back to Pyongyang, so that he could debrief what has been discussed at the summit meeting with Trump. But that was not made. I think Mr. Kim made a very interesting decision yet, because just staying in a couple of hours a day on his way back to Pyongyang, he made another very important kind of impromptu kind of visit to Beijing, which is more stately, and he is much more welcome from Xi Jinping. So I think that's why he made another important visit to Beijing and Dalian in China as a whole in 3 months.
So North Korea was always, I mean, Kim was always, as you said, probably planning to brief Xi Jinping on the summit, on the results of the summit in some way or another. But then there is speculation as well, not just that they're briefing on the results of the summit, but also they go discuss how the roadmap towards the regime security, to secure the regime security alongside the denuclearization deal. What do you think Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un discussed? I mean, we can only speculate, but what the things they would want to have covered?
Because many speculations are already out there, because many people, after the summit meeting in Singapore, the two leaders of China and North Korea definitely want to talk about the most important issues on their agenda. That is the roadmap for denuclearization on the Korean, particularly in North Korea, but also how they're going to make a new relation between the United States and DPRK, how they're going to build a new peace region on the Korean Peninsula, because China believes they are really deeply involved in these two issues, denuclearization and also the peace regime on the peninsula. That's why definitely these two issues actually top their agenda, no question about that. But also some other issues at the leaders level, they were talking about how they're going to provide some economic incentives to North Korea in return for the denuclearization and also the building a new security regime on the peninsula. So they were maybe talking about what kind of economic sanctions, economic assumptions they might provide to North Korea. But also sanctions, of course, even though North Korea is fully implying this UN Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea, but they're all bilateral sanctions on North Korea. So they might easing that kind of sanctions on North Korea, because the time is coming pretty shortly that North Korea might have another kind of floodings in North Korea. So probably in this kind of humanitarian assistance from the outside was definitely needed from South Korea, United States. But China has been always the major provider of all these aid to North Korea when there's a big flooding. So again, speculation goes on like that. They might talking about what kind of aid they can get for if there is another flood relief in North Korea. Yeah.
Those lifting of sanctions they might have talked about, as you said, but what does that actually mean? Because right now, the UN sanctions are still in place, but if China wants to lift sanctions of their own and help North Korea, won't that butt heads with what the US and what Trump wants to do, where they want to keep maximum pressure and sanctions on North Korea until North Korea shows complete denuclearization, or at least the process of denuclearization?
That's right. So China was willing to comply with the UN Security Council imposed sanctions. But as I talked to you, they have own individual country specific sanctions on North Korea. So they might work on easing those specific sanctions rather than UN Security Council position, because otherwise it might cause tremendous problem with the United States, but also some other UN member countries as well. So China might begin with a very easy and very humanitarian kind of assistance to North Korea without officially, eroding the Security Council, resolutions or the sanction system. So they're going to actually provide some actual help to North Korea so that North Korea really gets some assurance about its own regime. This is another way of very important role China might play on North Korea.
Kim's trip to Beijing coincided with the announcement that the South Korea and the United States were going to halt joint military drills, the Ulchi Freedom Guardian drills, as they're called. China has been calling for this for a long time, and I'm sure they would have welcomed it very much. But what do you think of the argument that the suspension of the drills was actually not a concession by the US, but actually a way to pressure North Korea to take steps towards denuclearization? What do you think of that kind of argument?
My thinking is, this kind of suspension is a very important military exercise. We call it combined military exercise and training. Actually, three in a year. It's not a concession. It may look like concession, but it's a kind of prime water that North Korea should do something in advance, because they decided to talk about the denuclearization and the peace regime on the peninsula. So North Korea, because they gave one incentive, which is getting rid of nuclear facilities and rocket and test sites. So the United States was asked to do something in return. So I think this is a kind of quid pro quo by North Korea and the United States. So this should not be this kind of suspension of nuclear military exercise should not be seen as a concession, because we have, even though we reported very lately, and there was a lot of criticism that the United States, South Korea have not talked seriously on these issues in advance. But I think we understand and missed this kind of military exercise, because it's not just for North Korea, but China definitely. Because the Chinese always show anger and worry whenever we have a very massive military exercise between the two countries, United States and South Korea. This was typical case, the typical response from Beijing. So a couple of years ago, when you had the annual military exercise like Key Resolve and Fall Eagle, they already angrily responded, blaming all these as war games, even though they was far away from the Korean waters, as a matter of fact. So, but when the U.S. naval aircraft carriers were about to enter the Korean waters, they made a very strong, kind of protest and rebuttal. Why you are here? So this is not just for the United States, but for the North Korea, I'm sorry, but China as well, because they believe these military exercises between the two allies are actually hostile to them, this provocative term. But of course, from our perspective, it is a purely, defensive in nature, because we will never, because of democracy, we cannot enter or attack North Korea or China. It's impossible. But when there was there were an intrusion, maybe there was a military provocation from North Korea, and when we are required to respond strongly, then this massive military scale is a really important kind of deterrence. So we are not talking about the war. The most important thing, what matters, is deterrence. So we have to have this maintain a very high level of deterrence in the olden times, in ordinary times, so that we can be really ready if there is a contingency occurs on the peninsula. So this is more about the military exercise, deterrence purposes, and if deterrence fails, we're going to have to win. Very clear. But Chinese have been very strongly, opposed to this idea. So this is not just North Korean reaction to this, key resolve issues, the suspension. I think Chinese will be very happy, welcoming mostly, as a matter of fact, more than North Koreans, by this suspension of our very important military drills.
Well, very interesting, Professor. Thank you for coming in today. We're right out of time, unfortunately. But it's always great to get your insights and opinions.
My pleasure. Thank you.